All right. Hey, welcome to the neighborhood today. We are still in the midst of our summer worship series, The Art of Neighboring. And I want to tell you the story of these two neighbors that are sitting in a backyard on their patio, and they're drinking coffee. And one neighbor inadvertently spills an entire cup of coffee on his other neighbor's sweatshirt. And he's so embarrassed. He's like, oh my gosh, strip off your sweatshirt. Let me take it in the house and wash it. And he goes like, are you kidding? This is all right. And he said, no, I've got it. Let me do that. And he was so embarrassed, and he was relentless. And finally the guy's like, all right. And he strips off his sweatshirt for the guy to take in the house to the laundry. So he's taking this sweatshirt into the house. It's dripping with coffee. And he yells out when he gets in the house to his wife who's across the house, honey, I have this sweatshirt dripping with coffee. I need to put it in the laundry. What are the instructions? And he waits to hear back, and finally she answers, well, I don't know, honey. What does it say on the sweatshirt? She listens for a reply and takes a few minutes, and finally he yells out, St. Louis Cardinals? No. So it's all about neighboring. We're talking about being a neighbor this week or this summer. And so I asked a really good question last week. I asked, who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? And I think that's a really great question because it really prompts us to embrace the response. And the response is, in God's eyes, everybody is my neighbor. In God's eyes, everybody is a neighbor. Whoever God has created, every human being is a neighbor. We are all worthy of God's love and God's grace. And that really means that not one of us is better than another or more deserving of God's love in God's eyes, right? And nor should that even be our own visual perspective, that we're somehow better than another human being because, and then fill in the blank. No, we should see everyone as our neighbor, as equals, if we truly desire to live like Jesus, right? So that really means that we shouldn't put ourselves on a pedestal, that we don't put ourselves first when it comes to discipleship. It really means that we must be willing to sacrifice for the needs of our neighbors. We heard a story last week, you might recall. It was about the Good Samaritan. And this was a person who stopped on a very dangerous road, an actual road outside of Jerusalem, and rendered care to a stranger, to a neighbor, really. And that's what it's like to truly be a neighbor. And this theological perspective calls us to shift our view of the church. When we really get that everyone is our neighbor and that everyone is on equal footing with God, it causes us to shift our perspective in the church. And I say that because many Christians, and we've been thinking this way for decades, so often think that the church is solely for them and their benefit and their welfare. When in fact, the church really belongs to God. Right? So to say, hey, this is my church, no, or this is the Methodist church, it's God's church. And the church should be for those who do not know about God's love, who do not know about God's unconditional grace. Well, then what am I supposed to do? Well, if you're here and you've accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior in your heart, right, then you're heaven-bound. Right? You've been saved, and so we make way for those who don't know about God's love, God's unconditional grace. So we serve as hosts. We are the host to that truth as we invite our neighbors to experience the love of God, to experience God's love as we reach out to them and we build relationships with our neighbors. The authors of this summer series that wrote the book, The Art of Neighboring, Jay Pathak and Dave Runyon, this week, the two chapters that we're covering in this, they offer that there are two barriers, two impediments we have to recognize when we're reaching out and trying to build relationships with our neighbors. There are two things that will really be a challenge. And number one is time is a real barrier, a real challenge. And the other is fear. Fear, right? And neither one of these, when I read these in the book, I said, neither one of these really come as a surprise to me. Because I certainly can relate to having way too much to do in my life on a daily basis. Then there is time to do it. We all live very full lives, very blessed lives, I hope. And so when anyone, whether it's one of your children or a spouse or a parent or a boss or a teacher or a pastor, says to you, here, let's just add one more thing to your plate each day, I get how we might be resentful of that invitation, right? So I'm well aware that when I challenge each of us to step out and reach our neighbors, that you might be wondering to yourself, where on earth am I going to find the time? So time's a real barrier. The other barrier, the other challenge is fear. Fear, right? In a world that's filled with extroverts and introverts, and frankly, I don't know who outnumbers whom in that, but those of us who identify as being introverted, it can make us feel very uneasy being challenged to go out into the neighborhood and engage a neighbor who may be a stranger in a conversation. I get that. I really do. It's very clear to me. So let's turn to the Bible for some wisdom and some insight on this. In Luke's Gospel, in chapter 10, we discovered Jesus is on a journey. Now, that shouldn't come as a surprise because I think you can pretty much open any of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and wherever you see the adult Jesus, he was always on a journey. He was always moving about. He was always going somewhere on a journey. And you know, something we don't often think about, as Jesus journeyed in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, he didn't have a Marriott to check into, or even a Motel 6, or a Howard Johnson. Y'all remember Howard Johnson's? Yeah, right? He didn't have McDonald's, or fast food, or even slow food, right? He relied on the kindness of neighbors to support his ministry, to feed him, to feed his entourage, to put him up for a time of rest, right? And so we find Jesus on a journey, chapter 10, Luke's Gospel, which led him at this point to the home of two sisters who are going to show him some radical hospitality. The sisters we know are named in the story. They are Mary and Martha. And Jesus has stopped by for a neighborly visit. Here's how Luke's Gospel describes the encounter. Now, as they went on their way, they being the entourage with Jesus, as they went on their way, he, Jesus, entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. And she had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. Now, this is a brief story. It doesn't go into a lot of description, but we can make some assumptions. Mary and Martha knew Jesus was coming by for a visit. Martha, being the hostess that she is, has gotten ready to do some big prep work, that even when Jesus has arrived, there's a lot to do. Meanwhile, Sister Mary plops herself down at Jesus' feet and listens to his every word, right? So if any of you ever had any siblings in your life, a brother or sister, this might resonate with you, that when there's work to be done, you have somebody that's just happy to sit, right? So Mary sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha, who was distracted by her many tasks, and I'm going to presume in the kitchen getting this nice meal ready, so she came back out of the kitchen to Jesus and asked, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her to help me. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by so many things, and there is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, and that will not be taken away from her. The end. That's the end of the story. And then as you continue to read the gospel, it goes on to another encounter. So no matter how many times I hear this story or read this story or I hear it preached or I preached, I always have to stop and think, okay, am I a Mary or a Martha? Because really, each of those characters in this story resonate with me. I can relate to both of them. I mean, think about this in your own lives. Perhaps you've had that time when you were the host or hostess in your own home, And you invite people to come over and you show them in as they arrive, and you get so busy with all the details, making sure the coats are in on the bed and getting into the kitchen to make sure the food is ready and the table's set just right, and then all the cleanup afterward, that the entire event comes and goes, and you realize you had absolutely little or no quality time to be with any of your guests, right? Or you've been to somebody's house and you were greeted warmly, and then your host and hostess take your coat and they go off, and they are so consumed with making sure the evening is so perfect that you go home having had a good time, but wishing you'd had a stronger encounter with your host or hostess that night. Just some quality time to sit and chat. So perhaps Martha's words resonate with you. Tell her to come help me. Because there are those times in our lives, we all feel this way, when we worry about having enough time to get a task done. Amen? And we worry about putting our best foot forward, hoping to make a good first impression, while at the same time being so fearful of failure, which sometimes can just cause us to be unglued. I know people like that. If everything's not perfect, they just become unglued, right? I need some help in here, was a cry I often heard from the kitchen, one of my parents yelling out for a family of 10. They were always in the kitchen doing one of the meals, right? And maybe you've had that point in your life where you just feel so desperate, or you're so worried about something that you cry out for help. Worry, fear, anxiety, it can have great power over our lives if we allow it. The famous poet Robert Frost once said, the reason worry kills more people than work is that more people worry than they do work. And that might be true, I don't know. But worry and anxiety and fear, really, think about it, it's everywhere. Anxiety is a normal part of our daily existence. We get anxious when we perceive danger, right? You're taking out the garbage cans at night and it's dark and you hear a loud noise, you get a little anxious, you get fearful, right? You may have remembered the anxious moments when you were in high school or college, right before that big exam, or right before or at graduation. A lot of anxiety, a lot of anxiousness, right? Who among us here today wasn't anxious at your wedding? And maybe even a little fearful, right? Riding those fast rides at an amusement park, speaking in front of people, is one of the biggest causes of fear in North American society. And if you notice, none of those things that I just listed are necessarily negative things. They're just things that cause anxiousness, worry, fear. It exists in every family, no matter how big or how small, no matter how healthy or how dysfunctional. Anxiety is a way of life. It is part of our reality. What is important is how we choose to deal with it. How are we going to choose to deal with anxiety and fear in our lives? How are we going to cope with those feelings? So, whatever it is that this morning you're thinking, oh boy, I can name it right now. Whatever it is that is causing you to worry, to be anxious, fearful, I want to offer some tips this morning to help provide some relief, probably. Tip number 1, whatever that thing or things are in your life that are causing anxiety or fear, name it. Name it. If your life is hectic with too little time, acknowledge that. Just say it out loud. I need more hours in the day, Lord. Or perhaps a better prayer might be, I really need less things to do every day, right? If you're fearful being in a crowd, if you really get anxious when meeting new people, you might say to yourself, I can overcome this. I can truly overcome this. God will provide me what is needed for the task ahead. And then believe that prayer. Because you see, in naming something, whatever it is in our lives, and we all are going to name different things, it lessens our anxiety and then allows us to address it. Think about Martha. Oh, bless her heart. She wanted, Jesus is coming to her house for lunch. All of you think it's 11:45. If you knew Jesus was coming to your house in 15 minutes, ladies, I know a lot of you would be up and out to your cars already. Am I right? You would be so anxious, so anxious. So here is Martha. She wanted everything to be perfect as she prepared this meal. And I can just imagine Martha saying to Mary, oh, I've got this great idea for lunch today. It's going to be a fishing theme. Because all the disciples were fishermen. So we're going to have fish and chips. and I'm going to throw this net across the table, and I'm going to very carefully fold the napkins into little tiny fishing boats. She was so excited. And yet, I imagine she was very fearful that she wouldn't have the time or that everything wouldn't be just perfect enough to please Jesus in her mind, right? That's what she might have been thinking. So, overwhelmed, she named it by calling out for help, right? Now, notice Jesus did not fault her for calling out to help. Not at all. He called her out for not understanding which was a priority. Perfection, getting the meal ready, or reflection, being at Jesus' feet for a quiet time to just be with Jesus. So it's okay to call out for help. That's not the point of the story at all. It really is just understanding. We get so caught up in perfection that we forget about reflection. We miss the opportunity to be with Jesus instead of being in a time of reflection with Jesus. Okay, so the second tip is to commit. Commit. When you know that you need more time in your life, or you are fearful of something that is going on in your life, it can often feel overwhelming. And when we feel overwhelmed, a lot of people often describe that as a feeling of paralysis. I'm so overwhelmed, I can't do anything. I feel like I'm mired down, I'm in limbo. And when we feel this way, and those feelings are very valid, by the way, I don't want to discount that at all, we must be willing to put one foot in front of another in order to provide some forward momentum, some forward motion when we feel stuck in life as a way to transition forward. One of my favorite authors, his name is William Bridges, and he has authored a couple of really good books on transition. He says we really need three things when we feel stuck, when we feel fearful and mired down in life. He says we need a purpose, we need a picture, a vision, a picture, and we need a plan. So we need a purpose, a picture, and a plan. So the purpose is you identify your intention or reason for change. Why do I need to change in my life? So why do I need to schedule more time for myself in prayer, reflection, to be at Jesus' feet? Or what's to be gained by setting some time aside to go meet my new neighbor? So decide your purpose. And that's why you ask good questions like that, because the answer gives you purpose. Second is picture. If you're going to change something in your life, what does that look like? How do you envision that? What will change look like as you begin to feel like you're granting yourself more time to do what you want to do, or grant yourself permission to get out into your front yard or your neighbor's yard and engage in conversation? Literally have a vision of what that will look like, because until you can envision it, it's hard to get to that place, right? Moses told people, we're taking you to the promised land. Well, what will it look like? He casted a vision, a picture of milk and honey. Because back 4,000 years ago, milk and honey were a big commodity, right? So the people are like, milk and honey, let's go, right? So picture what that'll look like. And then finally, have a plan. Have a plan in place. Step by step, devise a reasonable plan for setting aside some time each week. And if your life is so hectic, maybe you only say, I'm going to take 15 minutes in the week ahead, and this is my time to be in prayer or to talk to a neighbor or whatever it is. And you're going to figure out what that is, and you're going to stick with that, right? And then I want us to think about these tips as a way of moving us forward when we do feel stuck, when we feel a lack of time or challenge is so great that it makes us fearful. We all have got to set aside a little time anyway just to do some Mary stuff. We all need to schedule time in our lives every week, if not every day, to just sit at Jesus' feet. And that is that's what Jesus wanted Martha to understand. Yeah, it was wonderful that she was trying to be a really great hostess in there and cook everything, but she really, of the greatest benefit, Jesus would have to get up and leave sometime during that day, and she would have missed all that. He just wanted her to come and sit at his feet. Does that make sense? And the other thing to think about is Mary didn't stay at his feet all day either. At some point, Mary had to get up and maybe go set the table or help bring the food out or do the dishes afterwards. Mary didn't stay there long, and at some point she had to get up and move forward with her life. Moving forward is what Jesus did his entire life. Jesus was never stagnant. It would have been so easy for Jesus to get bogged down with all the demands in any community and lack of time for him to say, I'll tell you what, I'm just going to stand here and you all come to me. But no, Jesus was always on the move. always on the move, always moving forward. And when you think about it, God has never called anyone to be stagnant in life. God has never called anyone to remain the same and be unchanged. And when we do feel that way, Jesus is the first to say, come on, follow me. And we get up where we are in life and we begin to follow Jesus. Jesus even kept moving the disciples forward, right? Until at last he could step away and they kept moving on their own. And he sent them out in the world to teach and baptize every neighbor they encountered. And that's our call too. Jesus calls you and me to go out and encounter our neighbors and invite them to know the love of Jesus Christ. But we're going to do this very incrementally. We're not just going to say, go out and pick 20 neighbors today and start preaching to them. Well, nobody's going to do that, but we can do small steps. If you were here last week, we began with the very first step. We had what's called a block map, and we handed these out. It's a magnet on the back, and on the front is a little map, and we still have plenty of these, so if you weren't here last Sunday, when you go out to the gathering area on your way home, grab one. It's free. It's a gift from us to you as part of this summer worship series. On this block map, there are 9 homes, 9 blocks. There's a little symbol of a house in each of them. In the center, that house is highlighted. Whose house is that? Louder, please. Yes, it's your house. It's my house. And so the challenge last week was fill in the names of the people who live in your house. So if you live alone, it's just you and your dog or your cat, write down your name and your cat and dog's name. If you're a big family, write very tiny and get everybody's name in there. And then the second part of this joyful challenge, and I don't want anybody to feel like, oh my gosh, they're making me do this. I want you to find some joy in this. The second part of the challenge was all the neighbors around you, write in their names. Pastor Scott, I don't know their names. Okay, so the challenge was go out and meet your neighbors and find out their name. Well, I know most of their names. I know only their first names. That's okay. Write in their first names. But to accomplish what we were challenged with last week, it really calls us to get out and know your neighbors. Now, I was delighted after last week's service, and I walked out in the gathering area around noon. All the children and youth were busy filling this in. They know their neighbors. And a lot of you said, I know my neighbors. And I said, okay, wait for challenge 2 that comes today. We're going to do something different every week. So take some time this week. Grab one of these if you don't have one. Start to explore your neighborhood, learn your neighbors' names, even if it's only their first names. If you've done that, then the next step in the days ahead is just write down 1 or 2 very basic things about them. Maybe a favorite hobby they have, an interest that they have, anything that you want. Now, what we want to do next is address those 2 concerns, those 2 barriers, those 2 challenges, time and fear. So you're going to need to carve out some time in your busy schedules. I am to all of us to think about, okay, I'm really serious about the art of neighboring, and if I'm going to spend some time with my neighbors and I'm already feel overwhelmed by not enough time, I've got to really think about when am I going to take 10 minutes, 20 minutes, a half hour each week and really engage with my neighbor. And you might think also, the pastor doesn't realize how fearful it is for me to meet strangers and try and engage. You know, when we feel fearful about something, an excellent companion when confronting fear is prayer. So if it's really fearful for you, go talk to your neighbor. You can say, God, send your Holy Spirit to remove this fear so I can at least go say hello to my neighbor. And trust that God will provide that, and then be courageous and go out and begin to engage the neighbor. So as we move forward in the summer ahead with this wonderful series and accept the challenge to learn about our neighbors, let's be open to all the possibilities that God has for us to be Marys and to be Marthas as we engage in this art of neighboring, in order to literally reach out to our neighbors and build genuine, real relationships with our neighbors right outside of our doors. Believe me, God is with us on this journey. We are not alone. But I do invite us to take some time this week to just sit at Jesus' feet, quietly, contemplatively, and ask the Lord to guide your steps in visiting your neighbors around the neighborhood. And trust God and trust that the Holy Spirit will be your companion as we continue the art of neighboring.